Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our panelists, speakers, and members of Rare Earth Industrial Association, along with the participants of this webinar. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Badrinath. I am currently the president for Rare Earth Industrial Association, along with my full-time job at Grundfos, Denmark. I would like to introduce you to this webinar on the topic, what does the future holds for rare earths? As a part of our delivery and commitment towards the rare earth industry, we would like to bring in the quality information in regards to market analysis, geopolitical aspects, as well as the dynamics of these materials, along with the technical perspectives to our industrial partners and to the industry that will be very helpful for the building of sustainable and transparent value chains. As you all know, that Rare Earth Industrial Association commitment and the mission towards building sustainable and transparent value chains within the rare earths. We would like to introduce the speakers, and first of all, we would like to thank and welcome all our panelists and speakers who has accepted our invitation to participate in this webinar. I would like to welcome first Sylvie Bermann, former ambassador to China, Janet Zink, director, Canadian Natural Resources, Mark Seddon from Argus Metals, Henry Sanderson, Financial Times, Bernd Schaeffer, CEO, EIT Raw Materials, and Dr. Chen from Chinese Academy of Sciences. We all welcome you, and we are very keen to listen to your valuable information and to say what the discussions goes on for this specific topic. What does the future holds for rare earths? And with this, I would like to hand over the session to Florence, who is our Chief Communication Officer. And I welcome you all again, and I hope you will really enjoy this session. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
My name is Florence Gomez, and I'm the newly appointed Chief Communications Officer at REIA. I have met some of you, but not all. This is actually my very first event, and I'm very happy to introduce our first keynote speaker, Miss Sylvie Bermann, who will address us on the current geopolitical context, a topic she knows very well, given her background and experience. Sylvie started her diplomatic career in 1979. She worked for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the United Nations, and the EU. She then took the respective roles of French ambassador to China from 2011 to 2014, where she was the very first woman to hold this post in a country which is a permanent member of the Security Council. She subsequently wrote her first book, La Chine en eau profonde, it's in French, unfortunately, published in 2017, which I strongly recommend to those who understand French. Then she was French ambassador to the UK from 2014 to 2017. This is where we met and where she witnessed the Brexit saga. And actually, the local press in the UK used to call her the Glambassador. In February this year, she published her second book, Goodbye Britannia, The Brexit Challenge for the UK, and the English version will be available this September. And finally, she was French ambassador to Russia from 2017 to 2019. I remember visiting her in Moscow, while the French residence there is a masterpiece of architecture. And when you enter the reception room, on the grand piano lay three photos, Sylvie with Xi Jinping, Sylvie with Her Majesty the Queen, and Sylvie with Vladimir Putin. I think that sums it all up. And in 2019, she was one of 5 French ambassadors in office to be elevated to the dignity of Ambassadeur de France. There's no translation actually in English. Only 2 are elevated every year. She speaks fluent English, Chinese, and Russian. She lived in Hong Kong, Beijing, New York, Brussels, London, Moscow, and now Paris, where she currently chairs the board of the French Institute of Advanced Studies in National Defense. Sylvie is a commander of the French National Order of Merit and an officer of the French Legion of Honor. She has kindly agreed to take a couple of questions after her speech. Henry Sanderson, the commodity correspondent for the Financial Times, will moderate the debate. Henry and Sylvie have China and the UK in common. I thank you both very much, and of course, the rest of the speakers and panelists as well. And Sylvie, now the floor is yours. Thank you.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Florence, for your kind words, two kind words. And I'm very honored to have been invited by REIA. As well, Florence told you, I'm not a specialist of rare earths, but I'm more a specialist of geopolitics. But of course, it's very much related because, well, the new challenges, new threats, of course, are related to the question of rare earths. So to describe the new geopolitical environments, of course, it's very much led by the Chinese and American rivalry. It existed, of course, before the pandemics, but I think nobody paid so much attention. Of course, there was the trade war decided by Donald Trump, but apart from this, it was not this visible, and also maybe other countries, such as European countries, were not so much involved. Well, what kind of war is it today? Is it a war? Is it a Cold War? Of course, it's very different from what happened with Soviet Union, because Soviet Union was not involved in global economy. It was just ideological and military threats. Is it a hot peace? Well, considering some words exchange, in particular in Anchorage, between the Chinese and Russian diplomats, is it a cold peace? But nevertheless, it's a real rivalry, and it is also a multidimensional one. I mentioned the trade war. It started by that, and it was not that successful because, in fact, the Chinese surplus with the Americans increased and was not reduced at all. I will come back to the question of technology because I think it is the most important for the future. There is a diplomatic and ideological war, and ideological not because the Chinese want to influence the world or try to persuade the democracies to adopt their model, but on the part of democracies, and in particular on the part of the US, there is a will to push democratic values everywhere in the world. And also Joe Biden is considering a club or an alliance of democracies, even if it's difficult to describe countries that are real democracies. And there is a military dimension also, even if I don't think it will lead to a real war. And you know the book by Graham Allison, which is a very interesting one, which is the Thucydides trap. And I think it's very relevant because, in fact, it's the hegemonic country, Sparta or Washington, who is afraid of the rising country, Athens and Beijing. And so I think this description is very relevant, even if I think the world being very different, it won't lead to a real war. But there is military tension in the southeast, in China Sea, and in particular around Taiwan and also other countries. And China tends to increase the militarization of the waters around this small island. And the reaction of the US is to send warships and to try to enroll also other countries, and in particular from Europe. But I think, well, the most relevant today, of course, is the technological war. And you can not only call it a war, but it's also an American blockade against China, because, well, the Americans want to cut well, chain supplies and replace it by domestic supply chain, sorry. And also, they not only forbid Huawei in the US, but they also try to convince other countries rather successfully not to use Huawei. It has been the case in the UK. There was a decision at the beginning of last year to authorize Huawei. And there was a very interesting system, which I recommended to the French. It was a kind of controlled by the GCHQ, well, the intelligence services, and I think it was rather successful. But they're trying to also prevent other countries such as South Korea and, well, or Japan, or, well, Taiwan, to provide China with semiconductors. And on this field, China is lagging behind. So it's a problem, even if the reaction of China, obviously, like it was in the past, will be to increase its production in this domain. Is it going to be a decoupling of the economies between China and the US, or more largely China and the West? In fact, I don't think so, because China will remain engaged in global trade, global economy. I think, well, there are some advantages in some fields, and as you know perfectly, it's the case of the rare earths, and also a lot of American and European companies are more present in the Chinese market than in the American market. And for instance, General Motors is selling more cars in China than in the US. And also Tesla has created its gigafactory on electric cars in Shanghai. And that's the case of many other companies. So they are doing investments and they create factories there. But they're very quiet in this kind of Cold War for the time being, because they don't want to have problems. But it's an economic reality. And also, there is the question of the role of the EU, of course. Is the EU able to retain some strategic autonomy? Strategic autonomy doesn't mean only European defense, but it's also technological autonomy, and it's also economic autonomy. And I'm thinking of the extraterritorial sanctions decided by the US. And it could be the case on very sensitive issues. And also, of course, autonomy is about the possibility to increase our research and development on those technological goods. And in particular, it is relevant for climate change, and because it's the top priority in the world, and it's the top priority for the EU. So we need to use, of course, those rare earths. And also, I think we tend to consider the world from our perspective. It's meaning the US, well, European countries, but there are many other countries in the world, and China is very present in these countries, and in particular with the Belt and Road Initiative. And it was in order to find new markets, of course, to build infrastructures, but also it was about mining. And so it's very relevant to our subject. They started with Africa. We discovered it 10 years after they were there, but they are as well in Latin America, in the Middle East, and in Central Asia. And also they developed a very important partnership with Russia, which was not the case before because there was some mistrust between the two countries. And in any case, China doesn't accept alliances, but now it's a real partnership. Including on technological and military issues. And they decided to have a joint moon station. The Russians are helping the Chinese to put in place a new anti-missile system. And of course, on all those goods, you need some rare earths. So now what you know better than I do is that, of course, China is very dominant in this market, and it is leverage for China, a possibility to react to some trade war or some other kind of aggression or something which is perceived as aggression. And I remember when I was ambassador to China, there was this confrontation about Diaoyu Senkaku Island, and the reaction of China was to block any export to Japan. And then there was outrage in the world, and the Europeans and the Americans reacted. But in a certain way, it was our fault because we exported our pollution, and so we thought it was very comfortable that, well, China is polluting, not us. And after a few decades, we realized that it could be a problem for us. I think what is important in the future is, of course, artificial intelligence, and it's a new telecommunication, and we see with the pandemic that we use more and more digital tools, and so it's obvious that those rare earths will play an important role. We know what happened in Greenland when Donald Trump wanted to buy Greenland. But, well, it has also ecological consequences because we know that those climate change equipments are full of rare earths, and rare earths production, well, separation and so on is very polluting. So there's a lot of things to do in this field, and I think it would be better to have a kind of strategic cooperation in this field, that this actual strategic confrontation, because innovation can come from cooperation, and that's the reason why I am very, I think your international organization can play a very important role. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Now Henry comes in for the questions.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Fascinating presentation, and some very interesting geopolitical views. I'd just like to start off with a question about Europe and Europe's strategy, because we've seen them act in many ways like China in terms of using state aid to develop a battery industry in Europe, you know, coming up with an industrial policy. But do you think they should also support the rare earths industry within Europe? Or, as you say, if there isn't going to be a decoupling, if we're still going to be connected with China, do we need that level of strategic autonomy, or can we rely on international supply chains?
Well, I think both, in fact, where we realized during the pandemic that there was too much dependency on many issues. Well, it's the case of rare earths now, but medical supplies, for instance, and some of them, of course, have rare earths. So we have to discuss that, but I think the most important thing is to develop our research and defense funds, And also in the field of 5G, it's obvious that Nokia and Ericsson are lagging behind the Chinese, and I even listened to the CEO of Ericsson, who asked his government to keep Huawei because otherwise we wouldn't be at the same level. And I think there should be more funding in the EU, but it doesn't mean that we should cut all supply chains. I think free trade is also very important for the world and for humanity. And I think decoupling would be the worst thing to do. Well, battery, I think it's good to have independency on those battery production. There's a lot of field, but I think it's the beginning because we didn't pay enough attention before the pandemic. There was nothing absolutely new that we realized that there is this high dependency.
And just in terms of China and Xi Jinping, I mean, how much does China want to decouple from Western supply chains? They've seen the threat of Trump. They've seen the trade war. How much do you think they want to become more self-sufficient in technology?
That's a very interesting question, because self-sufficiency is somehow a Maoist concept. But I think that's what they're deciding during the last Congress and plenum is to be more self-sufficient and to develop also domestic consumption. So I think there will be more domestic productions and so on. But at the same time, I think free trade is very good for China, and Xi Jinping presented himself as a champion in Davos a few years ago after the election of Trump, and I think it is still in their interest. And the reason why I mentioned their relationship with other parts of the world, it's just to show that we are not alone in the world as we tend to consider in Western countries.
Okay, an interesting question from the audience here. I mean, Xi Jinping's committed to being carbon neutral by 2060 and emissions peaking by 2030. I mean, given that a lot of the polluting industry, as you said, went to China from the West, I mean, how serious do you think China is in terms of, true sustainability, in terms of transforming its entire economy onto a more sustainable level?
I think there is a real will. I mean, when I was there, I understand you were there at the same time, in 2011, it was the worst year. There was pollution and there was a denial by the government, but there was such an anger from the citizen, so that they changed their position. And now I think they are convinced that development and new technologies and are not contradictory. So I think they have done a lot already. But the problem and the most worrying situation is not what they're doing in China, because, well, innovation can solve the problem. And I think for rare earths, it's very necessary to have more innovation, to have a cleaner industry. But the concern is about the new Silk Road, because if they don't finance new coal factories in China, they do along the Silk Road, and so we have to be very vigilant about that, and just to tell them. But I think there's a real will, even if there are some contradictions. But we have contradictions too, because we want new technologies, renewable technologies, and they use this polluting process of extracting and separating rare earths. But we have to work together.
Got it. Just final question. I mean, you talked about China using rare earths as leverage, and obviously you were there when they reportedly suspended exports to Japan. And we saw during the trade war that Xi Jinping visited a rare earth magnet maker. I mean, do you think they would really, cut off supplies of rare earths to the West, or is this just a sort of threat that they can hold the whole time?
I think it is what is called deterrence. So it's just you show you have the tool of you have the arm, but you don't use it, and that's the reason why Xi Jinping visited those facilities, showing that they have it, but it's enough to have it and not to use it.
Interesting. Well, thanks so much, Sylvie. That's fascinating discussion. I'd like to move on now to introduce the next speaker, who is Mark Seddon. He's a senior manager at Argus Consulting Services, and he's going to give us a presentation entitled Rare Earths Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. And then we'll have some Q&A with Mark afterwards. So feel free to submit your questions and we can ask Mark. Okay, Mark, I'd like to hand the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for the introduction, and thank you to REIA for inviting me to speak today. And we've already had a very interesting presentation on the sort of geopolitics with China and the rest of the world, and also we've touched on how that kind of impacts a little bit on the rare earths industry. I guess my task is really to focus in on the rare earths, and the title is Rare Earths Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, and I've put a subtitle of Critical Elements for EVs and Renewable Energy, which, as we'll see, is really the key area in terms of the rare earth industry and the rare earth focus. So if I just move on quickly, well, that's all the legalese, don't really need to see that. An agenda, so I'm going to have a very, very quick plug for Argus, and for those that don't know Argus, then we'll get on to the market overview, so the current situation, and I've kind of divided it up into market drivers, the supply side, which is obviously where China is extremely important, a very quick look at current pricing and the near-term future for prices, and then an outlook for the market. So without further ado, this is just a view of Argus. For those that don't know it, Argus is one of the world's leading PRAs, price reporting agencies, and we now have over 1,000 staff globally with offices dotted around the world. Our headquarters is in London, and I'm actually in the office today, which makes a change. And then we have major regional offices in Houston, Singapore, and Moscow. But we have lots of offices dotted about, including a big office in Beijing. And coverage, we started out in the energy industry, but also then diversified into fertilizers, petchems, and metals is the most recent addition to the portfolio. And I sit in the consulting team, which looks at obviously market dynamics and forecasts for the markets and prices. On the rare earth side, this is just a plug for our rare earth services. So we have a rare earth analytics service, which includes a monthly outlook, and also a biannual longer-term rare earth analytics, which looks at the market in more detail, and we have our forecasts out to 2030. So we'll get the plug over and done with and get on to the meat of the presentation. So first of all, just to really locate the market in terms of the drivers and where the interest is, we've obviously seen that rare earths is a critical material, one of many, and one that's dominated by China. So there have been a lot of discussions and so on about it. And one of the reasons is the uses for rare earths. So the main market drivers really for rare earths would be the automotive industry. So this is conventional vehicles, but also EVs. So conventional vehicles, anything that has an electric motor, so windscreen wipers, electric windows, speaker systems, and so on and so forth. These are all driven by small rare earth permanent magnets. And in the EVs, you have all of these permanent magnets, but then you have the permanent magnet that drives the actual electric motor itself, which is much bigger. So if you look at it in terms of consumption of rare earth permanent magnets, a full battery electric vehicle probably has 4 times as much by weight of rare earth permanent magnets in it than a conventional vehicle, and a plug-in hybrid is probably around 2 to 3 times as much. So you can see that the automotive industry is already a big consumer of rare earths, but with the advent of vehicle electrification, this will only increase. Then if we go into energy and renewables, lanthanum and cerium have long been used in FCC catalysts, which is in oil production. But the more interesting area is in wind power, and particularly offshore wind turbines, where again you have a drive motor, which is in the offshore wind turbines driven by a very big rare earth permanent magnet. And the reason that rare earth permanent magnets are used in offshore wind turbines as opposed to onshore is that they have to be low maintenance, because obviously they're quite difficult to get to. So offshore wind turbines tend to use direct drive motors, which have to really be driven by the more powerful rare earth permanent magnets. Onshore wind turbines tend to be geared motors, and they can get away with a lower power permanent magnet, so it doesn't have to be a rare earth permanent magnet. And finally, the glass industry has been traditionally the biggest industry for consumption of rare earths, particularly cerium, but also some of the other light rare earths. Rare earths are used in glass as additives, but one of the main applications, particularly for cerium, is in glass polishing. So if we look at it in terms of volume and value, you can see the pie chart on the left is the volume of consumption of rare earths in the different applications, and on the right is the value. And as you can see, the glass industry accounts for nearly a quarter of all rare earth demand by volume, but only 7% by value. But then if you look at the magnet industry, again, it represents a fairly similar proportion of volume, about 23%. But if you look at it in terms of value, it's over 70%. So you can see why the renewable industry, EV industry, automotive industry is particularly important for rare earths, because that's what drives the rare earths market, particularly in the value sense. And if we look at it by individual rare earths, you can see that the light rare earths, cerium and lanthanum, the lightest rare earths, dominate the market by volume, over 63%. And the rare earth magnet materials, which are principally neodymium, but also praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, represent around about a quarter, just over a quarter. But then if you look at it in terms of value, rare earth magnet materials, so neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, account for over 90% of the market by value. So you can see that when you see communiques from companies that have rare earth projects, they're really focusing in on the content of neodymium principally, but also praseodymium and dysprosium and terbium, if they're lucky to have it in their deposits, and not so much talking about how much cerium and lanthanum they might have. So if we go for a very quick overview of supply, and this is where obviously the interest in China and what's happening in China is key. We can look at supply of rare earths, and we can see that it's been a growing picture in the last 5 years or so. And you can see that China still dominates supply of rare earths, even at the mine level. But it has been dropping in recent years. So in 2020, China accounted for around about 3/4 of the market. But we've seen, particularly since around 2018, mine output in China has started to drop, and it's been replaced effectively with imports from the US, so the Mountain Pass operation in the US, and also imports from Myanmar. So China has sort of outsourced a little bit of their supply to their separation plants. If we look at the China situation in slightly more detail, you can see that. Sorry, there we go. You can see that the government has actually started to increase the quotas, and that's had the effect, whether intended or unintended, of reducing unofficial or illegal production, how you want to describe it. You can see that's the red bar, and you can see that unofficial supply or illegal supply has reduced dramatically. So quotas is one way that the Chinese government has used to control unofficial supply. The other one is environmental impact. So the 6 main producing groups for rare earths in China now have to pass fairly stringent environmental checks. They also have to pay environmental taxes and so on. So the environmental inspections are a quick and relatively easy way for the authorities to clamp down on unofficial production. But you can see that overall production from China has reduced since around 2018. And as I say, this has been replaced with some imports from the US and from Myanmar. So if you look at it in terms of the individual rare earths, you can see that the light rare earths dominate. So cerium and lanthanum, as we saw, it's over 60%, getting on for 70% of supply. The one issue with rare earth production is that you have to produce them in order of atomic weight. So cerium comes first, followed by lanthanum, and then you go through the sort of what we would term maybe the medium rare earths, neodymium and praseodymium, through to the heavier rare earths like dysprosium and terbium and so on. And obviously the content of the deposits is predominantly light rare earths, although the ionic clays in the south of China have much higher values for the heavier rare earths. So this has led to significant oversupply of cerium and lanthanum, and of course the interest in neodymium and increased demand for neodymium means effectively you're producing more and more cerium and lanthanum, which is actually not required. So there are now fairly substantial stockpiles of cerium and lanthanum in China. And prices for cerium and lanthanum are extremely low. So if we look at it in terms of cerium oxide, cerium and lanthanum oxide are around about $1.5 to $1.6 per kilo. That compares to $80 to $90 per kilo for neodymium and praseodymium, and terbium oxide is closer to $1,000 per kilo. So you can see the difference in value. There's been a lot of research on the production side into producing individual rare earths, so being able to pick and choose and leaving perhaps the lower value cerium and lanthanum in the tailings or the spoils or whatever you want to describe them as. So there's been a lot of research on that front, but at the moment there are no commercial processes that do this. So it's still at the bench scale and pilot testing. And I mean, at the moment, for every ton of cerium or lanthanum that you produce, you're losing money. So you have to make it up with the value of the neodymium and the heavier rare earth elements that you have in your deposit. If we look at the separation of rare earths, then you can see that actually China is even more dominant because it's importing some ore from ores and concentrates from Mountain Pass. So that's all separated at the moment in China, although MP Materials is looking into separation in the US. So, and also obviously the production in Myanmar goes to China for separation. So really the only major separation facility outside of China is the Linus operation in Malaysia, so taking ore from Australia. There is a plant in Estonia which is run by Neo Performance Materials, which tends to separate material from Russia. There's a smaller operation in India run by Indian Rare Earths, and then there is some separation capacity in Vietnam, particularly, and also in Thailand. But in terms of overall percentages, these are very low. So you can see from the map that it's all very east focused rather than the west. And if we look at projects outside of China, there are plenty of projects to produce rare earth ores and concentrates, and you can see the various ones, whether it be in Australia, Africa, and so on. But most of these projects at the moment are only looking to produce a concentrate or a mixed carbonate. So most of these projects don't have separation facilities attached. Although with the current or the recent rise in rare earth prices, there's been a little bit more interest at projects in putting in separation facilities. As I mentioned, Mountain Pass is looking into separation. But there's also another couple of potential projects in North America, in the US and Canada, which are perhaps looking at separation of rare earths. But the current situation is that it's almost entirely dominated by China. So just a very quick look at prices and what prices have been doing, because there's been quite a bit of interest in rare earths, and there's been a jump in rare earth prices. So we saw particularly the prices for magnet materials, so rare earth magnet materials, as I mentioned before, neodymium, praseodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. So neodymium and terbium prices more than doubled between sort of October 2020 and March. So in the last quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, dysprosium prices increased by about 80%, and praseodymium by about 50%. So significant increases in rare earth prices, mainly due to supply tightness. So there'd been a reduction in supply in China, for example, but conversely, in the fourth quarter of 2020 and on into 2021, production and sales of EVs in China shot up. They were seeing doubling in sales, even more. So this led to a fairly near-term squeeze in the rare earth market. As you can see, rare earth prices reacted accordingly. But in the last couple of months, we've seen the prices come off these highs as supply has started to catch up, particularly in China. So prices peaked in March. And there was also talk of national stockpiling in China, which was helping to keep prices high. That didn't materialize, so prices have started to react to that and come off the highs. And really our forecast for the remainder of the year is for hopefully a gradual decline back towards the end of 2020 levels, although it will require higher demand outside of China to keep to support prices and to stop them falling back to levels we saw in 2019 and most of 2020. So I'm aware we're fairly pushed for time, so I'll go for a very, very brief outlook. As we've seen, the EV market and the offshore wind power market are key to the future for rare earths. This is our forecast for EV sales. So you can see that we're expecting global EV sales to hit 11 million units by 2025 and more than double to 23 million by 2030. And if we look at the offshore wind power, it's a similar situation. 2020, even with COVID, was a record year for global offshore wind power with 20% plus growth and 6.6 gigawatts installed globally, which was a record. And 2019 was itself a record. And the largest offshore wind markets, Europe is actually the largest offshore wind market. And within Europe, the UK and Germany are leading the way. And China only just became the largest individual offshore wind market with 10.9 gigawatts. So you can see that in the EV and rare earth offshore wind power space, it's a particularly interesting growth story. And this is what it does to the pie charts that we saw earlier. So this is the situation in 2030. And so by 2030, magnet applications have now taken the largest share by volume at 34%, and the share by value increases even further to over 80%. So we're forecasting 82%. And if we look at it in terms of the individual rare earths, cerium and lanthanum still represent over 50% of the market by volume. But by the time you get to 2030, rare earth magnet materials could account for as much as 98%, excuse me, of the value. So you can see why people are keying in on the renewables and vehicle electrification as the markets to follow for rare earths. So just a few concluding thoughts. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the effects of COVID obviously had a significant effect on the rare earth markets in 2020. But China in particular recovered strongly towards the end of last year, and this has continued into 2021. Outside of China, the picture is a little bit more patchy, but we are seeing some fairly significant growth in other markets. So we're hoping for a strong end to 2021, as a strong second half. Supply has eased in China now, so prices for rare earths have started to fall back. And we expect them to be back around about the beginning of 2021, end of 2020 levels by the end of the year. Medium to longer term, we're certainly going to need output from new projects outside of China to ensure sufficient supplies, because we've seen that the growth picture is very strong. And I think one thing that might be discussed in the panel is recycling and supply of rare earths from secondary sources, so things like coal ash and so on. And these will become increasingly important, particularly if countries outside of China want to get away from China dominance of rare earth supply. So I think that's all I have for that. I'm certainly happy to take any questions if there are any.
All right, thanks so much, Mark. Very interesting presentation. Just a sort of first question from me.
Sure.
You mentioned China cracking down on illegal mining and showed your graph about that. I mean, there have been reports that following the coup in Myanmar, there's been increased sort of illegal mining on the border with trucks going into China. I just wondered, what's your sort of analysis of that sort of situation?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because obviously with it being illegal or unofficial or whatever, then it's not recorded in the normal trade statistics and so on. So we have to kind of go on, you know, sort of eyewitness accounts and so on. And there is still obviously a trade across the border with Vietnam. And Vietnam is a country that does have separation capacity, so that's always been a potential destination for unofficial supply, if you like, out of China. So yes, I think it seems likely that there will still be some illegal trade, as it were. And that will only increase if the situation is fluid. But as I say, it's difficult to put a figure on it because, as I say, with it being illegal and so on, it's smuggled material effectively, so it's not going to show up in the official figures. So it's a little bit difficult to put a number on it. But we have seen that official imports from Myanmar don't seem to be affected so far. From the situation in the country. I mean, obviously there's a bit of a lag in terms of the statistics, so we don't have April and May data yet. But we have April data now. So I've seen that the official trade or official imports from Myanmar into China are still at pretty high levels. So in one sense, it hasn't affected the official trade so far.
Got it. And on your point about there being a lack of separation plants outside of China, apart from Lynas, I mean, what's been the difficulty with getting these projects up and running? I mean, the will is there, right? The political.
The will is there, yes. I mean, obviously, rare earths are at top of the critical materials list or near the top, yeah. And there's been a lot of reports. So, whether it be the EU, the US, Japan, and so on, they've all got governmental sort of organizations looking at this, and they produce various reports, yeah, and so on. So there's been a lot of talk, but not so much action. And I think it really comes down to cost and financing. So, I mean, if you look at the US situation, for example, Donald Trump put out an executive order to create a full supply chain for rare earth permanent magnets in the US. Which is all very well, but there was no real money behind it. There was a little bit of seed money, but not a huge amount. And the Mountain Pass operation is a sort of a cautionary tale. So a lot of money was pumped into that, including government money, and it obviously went bankrupt before it was taken over by MP Materials. So I think it's really a financial thing, and also when you look at rare earth prices. The rare earth prices of a year ago, 2 years ago, wouldn't really justify putting a separation plant in your project. It's just easier to send it to China to be separated. But with the rise in prices, that, as I say, there's been a little bit of an increase in interest in separation facilities. There's also talk of a company in the US that produces uranium, taking monazite, which has some radioactive elements in it, but they're looking to perhaps process some of that to produce some separated rare earths. So, it's slowly happening, but I think it's going to take cooperation, but perhaps even cross-border cooperation. So it may be that it has to be the US in conjunction with Europe and Japan and so on to really get significant facilities off the ground.
Got it. There's a question actually from the audience about new magnet technologies. I mean, can they be decoupled from rare earths? I know Tesla did use some non-rare earth magnets before. Yeah, what's your thoughts?
So, I mean, you can obviously use non-rare earth magnets. So there are non-rare earth permanent magnets that are out there. Ferrite magnets are the sort of the basic permanent magnet, if you like, but they're very low power, if you see what I mean. They don't. You need a lot of ferrite magnets, so it wouldn't be feasible in the automotive industry, for example, because obviously weight is a key issue, and weight. So you want the permanent magnet to be as small as possible. So the magnets that drive, electric windows and so on are really tiny. You could use a ferrite magnet, but it would have to be a lot bigger and would therefore take up more space, weigh more, and so on. There has been obviously quite a bit of research into the makeup of rare earth permanent magnets, because dysprosium was thought of as being particularly constrained on the supply side. So they tried to develop rare earth permanent magnets using little or no dysprosium, but the problem is they then don't perform so well. The dysprosium is there for the high temperature performance. So if you're using them in areas where you get temperature fluctuations, like in engines and so on, again, you can't really do away with it. So that's probably not really an avenue that you can do. As I say, those magnets exist, but they're not as performant as the rare earth permanent magnets. So again, that's why you see the difference between offshore wind power and onshore wind power. Onshore wind power, you can get away with a less powerful permanent magnet, so they tend to use ferrites and so on. The offshore ones, use the permanent magnets because they have to use the more powerful magnets. So.
Got it. And just a question I had about China looking for rare earth projects overseas. I mean, we've seen interest in Greenland. We've seen, even Mountain Pass, right? China's Shanghai Resources owns a stake in that, right? Sure. How much do you think they want to shift the mining or find new deposits overseas and just have the separation and magnets in China?
I mean, I think we're seeing that not just in rare earths, to be honest. I mean, obviously in some other things like cobalt, for example, they don't have particularly large cobalt reserves inside China, but they basically import all of their cobalt ores and concentrates from the DRC. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of other industries as well. Tungsten is an industry where they are dominant, but again, they are looking at projects overseas. And I think it all comes down to preserving their resources and adding value. So effectively, they'd rather be the world's source of EVs and wind turbines rather than, they don't ship rare earth concentrates anymore, but even separated rare earths, rare earth metals, even then, and then you go down to the permanent magnets, and then from the permanent magnets you go into the EVs and so on. So I think their focus, and this also comes back to your question about China using turning off the taps, if you like, as a threat. They could use that as a political threat, but also the threat is that they basically want to use their rare earths to produce the downstream products. So effectively, they'd rather export a permanent magnet and eventually an EV rather than the raw materials that make up that. So I think that's why countries outside of China really have to get their act together in that sense, because it won't be that China necessarily turns the taps off in that sense, but they'll just be using their rare earths to produce the downstream products. So they'll be less available for export.
And you mentioned that new technologies could sort of help isolate the rare earths you wanted and not the cerium and lanthanum. Could this help the economics of some of these Western projects then?
Certainly, yes. I'm not a process engineer or a chemist, but they're quite complicated processes, and it's quite difficult. As I say, at the moment, it's all bench scale, research and so on. But that's the direction of travel. because as I say, you know, for every ton of cerium and lanthanum you produce, you're losing money. So you've got to make that up with the other ones. If you could leave the cerium and lanthanum in the tailings, you know, happy days, then you wouldn't have to rely on so much on the, and also you wouldn't then be overproducing cerium and lanthanum to produce the neodymium that everybody really wants.
Got it. That's interesting. Well, thanks so much, Mark, and fascinating presentation. And yeah, thanks for your time. And with that, I'd like to move on to the next session, which is a panel session and a debate about what the future holds for rare earths. So I'd just like to briefly introduce the three panelists we have, and then invite them to talk for 2 to 3 minutes, after which we'll have a debate. So first we have Janice Zink. She's Director of Critical Minerals and Strategic Resources at Natural Resources Canada. And then we have Bernd Schaefer, who's CEO and Managing Director of EIT Raw Materials. And last but not least, we have Professor Chen Weiqiang, Professor of Sustainability Science, Institute of Urban Environment at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So Janice, do you want to kick this off by giving you your short introduction? That'd be great.
All right, thanks very much, Henry. And thanks very much to Sylvie and Mark for really setting the stage. I think that you covered a lot of material that's so relevant to our discussion that we're going to have now. So most people know that Canada is a mining nation, and they may not know that we have over a dozen advanced primary rare earth projects underway, one of them set to go into production very, very soon. And that we're focusing now the government investment in around upstream and materials engineering, and we've just established a critical minerals center of excellence. Part of the areas of focus are not only primary sourcing, but also secondary sourcing, as was noted by Mark. I think we see this as a very much an opportunity for Canada. And in addition, we've established several kind of hubs around rare earth elements. We just finished a 6-year research program and are embarking on another major research program. But we have the Saskatchewan Research Council, have many be aware, are investing over $31 million in the development of a small separation plant. We also have several rare earth R&D hubs in the federal government as well as around the country. So with this, you know, what we see with Canada and around the world is that we see some more resource nationalism. We see a desire for more integrated value chains, and there's certainly a focus on securing supply. At the same time, we see a lot more collaboration and interest to collaborate as we develop kind of more diversified value chains. One thing that's interesting to note, and I think this was mentioned by Mark, is that, you know, we look at the value chain for rare earths. We see the upstream being complex when we look at different mineral elements and costly, and whereas the value is downstream. So we see this battle between the upstream and the downstream, and where there's going to be that positioning of different nations along that value chain. At the same time, we're going to see a change, I think, in where we compete and how we compete. So it's going to move from the bottom line, I think, which has been the driver more recently, to things like sustainability and carbon intensity as we kind of move forward. Innovation will be definitely a driver, and this was mentioned by both Sylvie and by Mark, in terms of how we need to find new ways of extracting and processing rare earths, but also in terms of even valued end products. So and important drivers will be things like the use of traceability data, LCA, and other responsible sourcing standards. And interestingly, too, we see that the geopolitical influence is entering into things like standards, ISO standard space now. And what that might be leading to is maybe more robust standards, or even also possibly greater collaboration amongst the different players in trying to find standards that are kind of very much, as I say, robust. So also too, as mentioning LCA and traceability, we think that this is going to probably inform end user and consumer purchasing decisions. As we want to move towards more sustainably sourced products and responsibly sourced products, the use of LCA and traceability will be important. And as noted by the previous speakers, government policies become a greater influence now in defining these value chains and how these value chains will advance. I guess the last point to mention is relates to some of the previous points, is that this is around supply diversification. So there's going to be a continued need to de-risk the value changes and to ensure sustainable supply. And alternative sourcing models are going to come into play for sure. Greater use of reprocessed and recycled material, and end users may start to become suppliers, as we see the recent news from Volkswagen looking at, becoming a raw material supplier. So R&D will continue to be important as we want to focus on reduced carbon footprint, environmental performance, and always cost competitive processes. And so novelty of process and innovation will still be there. And I think we'll see hopefully a sharing of more and more around data sets amongst nations as we move towards diversifying our supply chains around rare earth elements and permanent magnets.
Thank you very much, Janice. That's great, and we'll come back to some of those topics. Bernd, do you want to follow on from that to give your presentation?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Henry, and dear participants, thank you for the kind introductions. Pleasure to joining this session and having been invited by the REIA to this very relevant thematic topic on the future of rare earths. I have no specific presentation. I will talk if you don't mind. Yeah. So, and as we all know, rare earth elements are essential materials. We heard this today for Europe's economy and the green political agenda. They're used in various high-tech applications, particularly in magnets for renewable energy, robotics, automotive, defense, and space. Today, these magnets are present in a number of modern applications, such as smartphones and tablets, as well as wind turbines and electric cars, which will constitute the primary application, as we heard also today, for rare earth elements by 2030. They are essential to achieve Europe's climate targets because they are used in the most energy-efficient refrigerators, water pumps, and servo motors. Yeah, specific rare earths used for magnets constitute only, also this we heard today, 25% of the rare earth production volume, but represent 80 to 90% according to our estimates of the total rare earth market value. Like semiconductors, they are of highest importance for the automotive industry. 95% of electric vehicles use rare earth permanent magnet motors. And there's another parallel to semiconductors. More than 90% of the rare earth magnets used in Europe come from China. This is why the European Commission considers rare earths to be the most resource critical of all materials. In China, the rare earth value chain is considered to be a highly strategic asset to secure a growing market share in major downstream industrial ecosystems. The largest rare earth mining and processing companies are state-owned and are sustained by various direct and indirect state subsidies. Today, there's only a small rare earth industry left in Europe, which is eroding as opposed to strengthening its position by providing supply for innovative industries and future markets. The exponential growth in demand for rare earth permanent magnets, particularly in automotive and renewables, has the potential to result in supply chain disruptions. In any case, EU manufacturers have a disadvantage in accessing the materials over their Asian competitors, and particularly suffer from price fluctuations driven by speculation. In order to increase Europe's strategic autonomy in rare earth elements, the full value chain needs to be considered and addressed, including circular economy aspects. Today, less than 1% of rare earth elements are recycled. In this context, the European Raw Materials Alliance, we call it ERMA, which is led by the EIT Raw Materials, has identified 14 investment cases all across this value chain and across Europe. If these were realized, 20 to 30% of Europe's rare earth magnet needs by 2030 could be sourced domestically in the EU from literally nil today, which is 15 times more than currently, and thus significantly strengthening its strategic autonomy. In a stakeholder consultation process that was run by the European Raw Materials Alliance, some action points have been identified with around 180 stakeholders in there. One is certainly creating level playing field. Second is driving commitment by EU OEMs to source from EU rare earth industry domestically, ensure that end-of-life products containing rare earths stay in Europe, and last but not least, building a diversified sourcing platform with reliable and sustainable partners outside the EU, such as Canada and Australia, to mention a few. With this, thank you very much for your attention, and I give the word back to you. Thank you, Henry.
Thanks very much, and we'll come back to some of those points. Wei Chang, do you want to go next? It'd be great to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Henry, for hosting the discussion. And my name is Wei Jiangchen. I'm a scientist working on material flow analysis and life cycle assessment of critical materials, partly focusing on rare earth elements in China. I would like to share my understanding on 3 keywords today. First, so the first one is on the REIA situation, and the second one is on innovation, and the third one is on collaboration. I would love to first talk about 3 REIA situation I have found. The first one is that we have to know that rare earth is actually not scarce. It's distributed everywhere globally, and especially for some rare earth elements, because we have more than 15 rare earth elements there. But today, actually, the most useful are just no more than 5 of them, actually. So, but when we are extracting rare earths, we at the same time almost extract all of them. And in China, we find that there are many rare earth elements that are actually not useful, and they are just piled up somewhere, some places. Globally, rare earth is found everywhere, and for some specific rare earth elements, they are not very useful. They're just piled up somewhere. And I think that in the last 2 or 3 decades, one of the reasons that China become the dominant country in the global rare earth supply chain is just because of the poor environmental regulation in China. I used to read a report from the United States in 1980s, and it suggests that, well, in they suggest the U.S. industry to invest, transfer some technologies to China to extract rare earths and other critical raw materials. Well, when the situation is quite different from today, So that is the first situation. The second situation, the second situation is that we found from the trade data that China has actually been increasing its export of rare earths, both in the amount and also in the types, the complexity. So we all know that in 2011 there was a quota, of rare earth export from China, but actually there was only applied to three types of the rare earth products, not actually on magnets and catalysts. Well, if we see the trade data, actually the export of rare earth products, from China has been increasing. We have papers, we have finished some of the studies. We can show some of the results later in some of our papers. That is the second situation. The third one is actually we have to understand, and we have to admit that actually the rare earth industry is very small compared to many other metals industry. So everybody think that, well, rare earth is sort of strategic and very important. But if we compare the industry output of rare earth industry, it is sort of tiny and very ignorable compared to steel and copper. So how can we, pay so much attention to rare earths if it is too small? So I think if people cannot have enough innovation and collaboration, perhaps in the future we may not have even enough money to support a association for rare earths. And then this introduced me to the second keywords, that is innovation. Because rare earths actually the industry is so small, and as that has been shown by Mark just now, the biggest market we can see for rare earths in the future is actually only the magnet. So I think we need scientific innovation, technology innovation. We need some more innovation and application like magnets for rare earths, especially for some elements like europium and cerium or lanthanum. If we don't have enough good technology to really use them to some very important and promising applications, I mean, they are just normal materials without too much importance. Actually, I mean, today actually rare earths get so much attention. My understanding is that it gets less attention just because it has the word rare there. It is not because it is really that important, right? So, and then the third keyword is about the collaboration. So just now, Henry asked a question whether China would love to be decoupled from the Western world in terms of technology. As a scientist, I used to be working in the United States in Yale University for 5 years, and I've come back to China for more than 6 years. I would love to say that China will never and does not want to be and will never want to be decoupled from the Western world, either in terms of market or technology. I think especially for rare earths and other critical materials, we have to work together to identify those new technology and applications comparable to magnets. And also, we need a global market. I mean, for some new products, without the global market, it is very difficult to really expand them. So these are my understandings. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wei Chang. Very interesting, and I will just be good to start off a discussion. I mean, you mentioned working together on technology and a global market. I just wondered, in terms of a global market, are you saying that rare earths should be traded on an international exchange or on an exchange where global price can be better set?
I'm not an expert on the market analysis, but I think it's necessary for rare earths to trade in a way that can benefit everybody, globally. Especially today that rare earth is important for the carbon neutral, goal. I mean, China is now having the pledge of the carbon neutral by 2060, and I think it's important, And also, China is now actually providing wind turbines and other renewable products to the global market, and actually these products bring a lot of rare earths embodied in them. And on the other hand, it's very necessary for China to get the resources, from global market. Like copper is very important for the Chinese new, also the new electricity, market. So without the global market, China cannot actually reach the carbon neutral goal. So I think we are now working living in a world that we need each other, Yeah.
Interesting. And in terms of Xi Jinping's carbon neutral target, I mean, what kind of pressure are rare earth companies under in China in terms of making their operations more environmentally friendly?
I have to say that the Chinese rare earth companies, they're under the pressure of making them more environmental friendly. It is not because of the carbon neutral pledge. It is because that it has to do that. I have investigated some of the facilities, and we found that, oh my God, the ecological burden, environmental pollutions used to be very terrible. So to some extent, China is now polluting part of its local environment to make the global carbon neutral goal achievable. So we achieve the global sustainable development goals, but locally people get more environmental costs. So also for other applications, rare earth has the problem, especially for separation plants too. So even without this carbon neutral goal, I mean, the Chinese government has to do something to make them more green. Otherwise, it's unacceptable.
Interesting. Janice, I wondered, what kind of innovations or opportunities are there in Canada to produce rare earths more sustainably or, with less environmental impact?
Yeah, so we just finished 6 years of rare earth element R&D. So some of the technologies were certainly focused on low energy technologies. For example, what we did is focused really on the minerals themselves and being able to understand how to decompose them. So oftentimes, for minerals that we have in Canada, you have to invest in fairly acid intensive or chemical intensive and heat intensive, cracking and baking. So what we've been able to do is kind of understand how the decomposition mechanism works. And that has led to some extremely successful breakthrough technologies, which have reduced the energy input quite significantly. So in addition to that, we have our whole program related to green mining innovation, which looks at energy efficiency and around comminution. And looking at more energy efficient and less intensive ways in which we have to break rock, but also to upgrade and to beneficiate the ore itself. So there are a lot of different pieces that are coming together very nicely. And then, of course, the other area that we're looking at is the secondary sourcing, particularly. I mean, we have work in magnets, but more in terms of our mineral waste in Canada and the opportunity around that. If you consider that they're already fairly pre-processed, the energy input there is far minimal, far more less intensive than, of course, with primary production. And at the same time, I think some of the other areas where we're looking at is, just our own energy supply in Canada tends to be very, carbon neutral. A lot of hydroelectric energy. So even when we get into more downstream into metal making and alloying, we have like clean carbon sources or clean energy sources in which we can apply here in Canada. So there's just a few areas how we're trying to get to carbon neutrality, not just for rare earth elements, but for mining in general.
Interesting. Bernd, I'd just like to bring you in here because, you mentioned less than 1% rare earth products recycled. I mean, that's just extraordinarily low, given the decades we've been using these products. What kind of percent of Europe's supply could we get to with recycling?
Well, I mean, this is much depending also on the political guidelines, which I cannot comment on too much, but certainly it's likely that targets will be set for certain products, and on this basis, the percentage will be defined. I don't want to give a number here, but there is certainly scope for rare earth elements recycling, exactly because the current rates are so low, and the potential is enormous, especially for products containing large amounts of rare earth elements, such as e-motors of vehicles, wind turbines, or hard disk drives. Yeah, this involves, however, creating a circular economy around rare earths by advancing recycling and substitution, as well as exploration, mining, processing, separation, metal making, alloying, magnet making, so the full value chain. Yeah, and we see a huge potential here. We see a massive potential, particularly in the wind turbine market. If this would be really subject for recycling, we could see a huge potential here.
That's interesting. Wei-Chang, what's the situation with recycling in China? Because I know for batteries there's a huge amount of recycling, but what about for the magnets?
I think China, the technology in the market is growing. formerly there was not that much recycling. It was not because the people would not love to do that. It was because there was no enough end-of-life products. So these days, with with more and more wind turbines and EVs reach their end of life, actually people are realizing the importance of doing so. So the company is trying to develop technologies.
Interesting. And
actually,
yeah.
It's easy actually. It's not that difficult to recycle, those from magnets. Well, for other applications, it's difficult to do that, So magnet can be very promising for recycling.
Interesting. And Wei Chang, actually a question from the audience. I mean, given the recent rise in prices we've seen for rare earths, I mean, do you think China will expand production and exports to reduce prices and stop projects coming on outside China, supply coming on outside China?
I don't know about this. I don't think so. I think companies would love to earn money, and this is a free trade war. It's very necessary for some companies to have some strategies, and but I think it's difficult to do something like what you have mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, prices have declined a bit recently. I mean, do you think that's going to continue?
I'm not an expert on this field, so it's difficult to make comments here.
Yeah, no problem. Bernd, I'd just like to come back to you because I mean, you're preparing this rare earth action plan for Europe. I'd just be fascinated to learn what kind of things are you going to propose? What's the sort of Europe's action plan? What can we sort of expect or look forward to?
Let me put it this way. The action plan is still in its draft, and we are still awaiting feedback from important stakeholders in there. But what we can say is that certainly the task forces in there, they've been doing a tremendous work, not only identifying the bottleneck and exposing inconsistencies in various conditions, also trade conditions, but also in making recommendations for overcoming such obstacles. The investment cases that will be supported here by the European Raw Materials Alliance will spearhead the establishment of a competitive and sustainable and resilient rare earth elements value chain in Europe and for European citizens. And on this basis, also the foundation is built that we will consolidate in terms of recommendations that could be followed in Europe. So I would ask for your patience. This action plan will still take a couple of days, and I will not talk about it too detailed here and today, but it's a very important paper, I think.
But just, I mean, can you tell us a bit about, I mean, do you recommend the EU sets a recycling target like they're considering for battery materials?
Yeah, I mean, there will be, of course, recycling recommendations given, like as we clearly see that we need to keep products in Europe. Let's start there. So there will be certainly a recommendation also for for closing material loops in Europe and introduction of policies that will valorize the recycling of end-of-life products in Europe. So that will be part of it. And as a consequence, we are going to also be more specific from a quantitative approach on putting some objectives on what would be targets to increase the recycling of rare earth elements products, in particular magnets, as this is the biggest lever that we see clearly to keep rare earth elements in Europe.
Interesting. And just a quick question. I mean, how does Europe overcome the sort of NIMBY problem? We've seen this with lithium projects in Portugal, etc., uranium projects in Spain. I mean, people just don't want mining projects in their backyard, right? I mean, how can Europe get over this issue?
Well, you are addressing probably the aspect of mining criticality in Europe as such, and what we clearly see is that there is a strong development ongoing in everything that relates to green mining. There are huge developments ongoing also in the lithium field, as well as in other mining activities in Europe, and I'm confident that technology here will certainly also increase the acceptance, social and environmental acceptance of mining activities in Europe. When we are talking mining, of course, we have to consider this in the context of a circular economy again, where I clearly see also all the urban mining and recycling activities, including product design, etc., waste minimization as being subject of it.
Got it. That's interesting. Janice, just like to come back to you. I just wondered how how open Canada would be for Chinese companies to come collaborate, invest in rare earth projects. What's the sort of?
So we've certainly had MOUs with China and different Chinese organizations, whether universities or associations, to collaborate. And so we have that proven record already. We've done that with green mining. So with regards to rare earths, I mean, of course, we would, in terms of R&D, we would love to collaborate because, I mean, they're the experts. So, you know, why wouldn't we want to work with those that know more than anyone else in the world? So, yeah, I think there's opportunities to collaborate on the R&D front, and there's always, I think Canada has always been open to collaborating with countries around the world in all things related to mining, particularly green mining, and anything that kind of advances the way that we can have a cleaner extraction of resources, particularly critical resources, to move to the, you know, a green and sustainable economy.
And you mentioned sort of using waste. I mean, there is efforts in the US to turn coal waste into rare earths. I mean, is this a sort of opportunity for Canada as well?
Certainly. So we have a number of different sources of rare earths in mineral waste. The uranium tailings are one source. Coal ash or coal waste is also another source. We have the red mud from uranium, from aluminum production. We also have, you know, phosphogypsum. So there are a number of sources. We've estimated some 600,000 tons of total REO contained in secondary sources within Canada. So a fair bit, you know, and so it's trying to find the right approach in order to extract that and to extract it in a way that we don't leave greater legacy behind. Well, we have a program called Mining Value from Waste, which is looking at just that, is looking at the recovery of critical minerals from waste across Canada. And, you know, there's, as I said, there's often a great upside to that, reduction in the liability. That's one thing, dealing with legacy waste, but also pre-processed material, so, you know, less intensity in terms of, you know, actual primary mining. But we have to be certainly cognizant of the fact that we don't want to disturb a legacy waste that could possibly expose it to atmospheric conditions and make things worse. So not all sites and all material is really amenable. So we've done a very good extensive database, and we've put together an assessment tool to be able to prioritize sites across Canada where we can go in and look at, you know, possibly on-site modular recovery of these different waste sites. But there is, you know, for all of the Canada's 31 critical minerals, there most, if not all, are contained in waste streams, and so that we see a huge opportunity for recovery from secondary sourcing, in addition to magnets and other kind of post-consumer waste sources.
That's fascinating. Thanks for that. There's actually another question from the audience. Yeah, Bernd, one for you actually, about Norway. Norway says they have huge rare earth reserves and looking for investors from EU and Europe. Do you believe an EU collaborative approach to support Norwegian projects?
It's not about belief. I mean, the European Raw Materials Alliance is an open and inclusive alliance, and if there is a project that is of interest in a region like Norway that can secure raw material supply into Europe, whether this is on rare earths or any other element or material, we are of course considering this.
Got it. And just another question. I mean, Wei Chang or Janice or Bernd, you know, how much will the rare earth industry be impacted by, you know, this wave of ESG scrutiny at the moment? And does this pose a challenge for global investment along the supply chain? Janice, perhaps you first on this?
Yeah, I don't think it's a challenge. I think it'll be an opportunity. And we have organizations like REIA that are at the forefront of trying to look at, sustainable production of rare earths. So this is where I think, tools like LCA, traceability, and international standards will come into play quite heavily. And I think it's really an opportunity for the global rare earth community to really set the stage in terms of saying, yes, we can produce these rare earths in a way that, and kind of dispel some of the myths regarding the production of rare earths. So I see it as an opportunity, not really as a negative challenge.
Wei Chang, what do you think? Is it an opportunity? For
I totally agree with Janice. And as I mentioned, it's very necessary to have more innovation and collaboration to really make the industry become bigger and more influential and useful, especially for the global sustainability.
But Wei Chang, is there a way to produce rare earths sustainably, in an environmentally friendly way?
Well, I think with better technologies and more stricter environmental regulations, especially in China, I think yes, we can do. There is one big change now for rare earth separation, and I think it's come from thorium, and the radioactive substance, and it is actually a very big challenge for rare earth separation, either in the United States or in China. So we need more and better technologies to solve these kind of problems. That is why I say we need innovation and collaboration.
Interesting. But how big a problem is the radioactivity? I mean, there are plans to build separation plants in the UK, for instance. I know radioactivity is a concern. How big an issue is it?
It depends. It's different in different places. So we need. I cannot say it, very quick, but I would say that currently the technology is only acceptable, but it's not enough. If we want to expand the production, and we need better technologies. Actually, in the United States, I think this is a very big issue to make the mountain pass doesn't work.
Yeah, interesting. Bernd, what do you think about the radioactivity issue in terms of Europe, building its own separation plants?
To be honest, I cannot give you a qualified answer on this one. Of course, we are looking at this, but I think that's more for my expert forum to give a good answer on this topic.
Interesting. And there's a question actually from the audience. Actually, Wei Chang, perhaps for you, is China willing to establish separation plants in Europe with European Chinese ownership? Do you think this is a possibility?
I cannot answer this question, but I personally would think it's good to do that.
Interesting. And what do you think about sort of Chinese companies coming to Europe?
Well, companies would love to earn money, right? If they can earn money, I think that in the world that allow free trade, they may want to do that. Right?
Yeah, got it. Just another question from the audience actually about the Arctic, and I just wondered, I don't know, Janice, if you could answer this, but about how will rare earth mining prospects in the Arctic affect the global supply chain in the future? Do you have any sort of thoughts on this?
Question of whether there are, or how we're going to manage them, or
how the prospects will impact the global supply chain in the future.
So I think one of our most advanced rare earth element projects is in Canada's Arctic, the Nechalacho project in Northwest Territories. And I think that, like any project, but I think particularly in the Arctic, managing the fragile ecosystem is paramount, and that companies that are working in that space are doing so and are engaging with the communities in those regions. So we also have a program called geoscience for energy and minerals, the GEM program, and the targeted geoscience initiative programs. And those are looking at, the first program, GEM, is focused on looking at finding critical mineral deposits in areas such as the north. So I think there are many opportunities as we, certainly in Canada, as we further explore our northern regions of the country.
Interesting. And there's another question. I don't know if you can talk about the US, but I mean, what do you think, Biden's approach is going to recommend for rare earths in terms of supply chains? There's been talk of the US relying on allies, Canada and Australia, instead of developing its own projects. What do you think of what's going to happen?
So I can't comment on what's going to happen. I can tell you that we are working closely with the U.S. under the Joint Action Plan and collaborating with them on a range of different working groups, some of them in terms of the diversification of supply, R&D, sharing of data. So we are working with our allied counterparts in this space of critical minerals. The U.S. is certainly at the forefront, but also with EU and with others in Australia. So there are many different collaborations and cooperational agreements going on that see us kind of working together. And as I said, I think it's very important is the cooperation that we're going to see as we kind of advance, not just for rare earths, but for critical minerals, and build those kind of diversified, secure value chains for permanent magnets, but for EVs and various different clean tech kind of applications.
Interesting. Wei Chang, I mean, how much do you think China is worried about a sort of united front against it, of Canada, Australia, America teaming up to create a supply chain separate to China?
I don't actually know, but I think it's difficult to stop that, right? So if you cannot really stop that, and why don't you embrace that? That is my understanding. It's necessary to collaborate rather than just always think about contradicting or competing.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, another question here, Bernd. I think this one's for you actually. Do you have any sort of thoughts or estimates on the impact on rare earth prices if a carbon border tax is introduced in Europe? What's going to be the sort of impact, do you think?
Well, my first reaction would certainly be that in the context of an increased demand in connection with carbon border tax, that is a natural trend to have prices further going up. This, however, would assume that the fundamentals that are driving the price are not being influenced respectively, speculatively underpinned, and therefore the direction would certainly be, from an unconstrained scenario, that they would be going up.
Interesting. And will this have knock-on impact on the price of EVs? We want them to be as cheap as possible, right? We want clean energy to be as cheap as possible. Is this going to hit demand?
I mean, I don't know the calculation model of the OEMs, so you should ask this question to the CEO of one of the major OEMs. This is cost pricing respectively, rather something in between.
Got it. I mean, Wei Chang, just a question for you actually. I mean, all prices are going up now, right, for a lot of raw materials: steel, copper, lithium, cobalt, rare earths. Does this threaten a sort of inflationary impact on the sort of car industry, clean energy industry?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
I'm just saying prices for all raw materials are going up quite considerably. I mean, how worried do you think China is about sort of inflationary impact and its impact on the price of electric cars and clean energy?
Well, I'm worried about that. I wanted to actually buy a EV car some months ago, and it seems to me that the price is going up now, and so that really impacted me. So we may have to ask Mr. Biden whether he's doing now. He's now pushing the price of everything going up. Right? Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, well, I think we're almost at the end of our session. If there's any more questions, feel free to send them across now. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank all the panelists and all the speakers today actually for joining the event, for the fascinating views on rare earths and the future. And it's been a great event. You know, honored to host this event. So yeah, thank you all very much for joining, and look forward to talking about this again soon.
I just wanted to wrap up very quickly and just thank, as Henry already did, all the panelists, the speakers, the organizers, Henry for moderating brilliantly. It was the very first time we had an event with a panel. I personally think it worked very well, and especially since we had views from the American continent, from Europe, from Asia. We'll try to keep doing that in future events. Also, we had 2 women on stage today, because I'm saying that not because I'm a woman, but because there are not many women in that rare earth world. So hopefully we'll manage to sort of have you know, gender diversification on our panels and the future events coming up. It was a pleasure for me to participate in my very first REIA event, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.